2017, and we have a lot of information to cover tonight. Of course, we're going to talk about briefly the Syria issue, but I think more importantly right now we're going to have to talk about what just happened in Washington with this micro coup of Michael Flynn by the CIA. This is becoming incredibly disturbing, very frightening times, and we'll talk about why that is and sort of the ins and outs of that situation when we get to it here in the broadcast. Now, the show is being recorded on February the 17th, which is a Friday night, because that's what some of us do on Friday nights while other people are out having fun and drinking. Some of us are here researching and doing shows. So that is how the cookie crumbles. Of course, this week, as you might be able to tell, I am feeling much better and no longer under the weather. I guess we should say above the weather. But we've still got a lot of information to cover, so that's what we're going to do. Now, for those of you who are joining us for the first time, of course, I have to encourage you to follow my work, activistpost.com, arrowofwisdom.com, naturalblaze.com, brandonturbeville.com, and, of course, Truth on the Tracks here every Monday night at 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time at ucy.tv. And the show is, of course, rebroadcast every Monday night and throughout the week at UCY. It's reposted by a number of websites, including Activist Post. Now, if you're interested in my work specifically, then, of course, brandonturbeville.com is where you want to be. That should be your homepage. That is the website where I repost all of my shows, all of the YouTube videos, all of the relevant information. Of course, the books are available there at that website as well, brandonturbeville.com, as well as the new book, Resisting the Empire, The Plan to Destroy Syria and How the Future of the World Depends Upon the Outcome. It's available at Amazon, but also at brandonturbeville.com in hard copy and Kindle version. I have to say, I am not just pleased with the success of the book, I am frankly surprised with the level of interest and the amount of books that have been distributed just since we released the book last week. We've had an impressive amount of interest for the book, and I'm quite surprised. And for those of you who are listening who've picked up the book, I greatly appreciate the support, and I graciously appreciate your interest, and hopefully we can turn that interest into action. And for those of you who haven't bought it yet, I encourage you to do so if you can, and help spread that information. It really does explain to you the whole situation in Syria from A to Z. It's not a rigorous academic study. It's written fairly simple manner, basically in the same way that you would read my articles. Now, without further ado, let's look at the Syrian crisis first, and then we've got to get into Trump. Can't get away from it. So let's first look at Assad and the safe zone plan. In my article on February 11th, Assad rejects Trump's safe zone plan, says Syria will be safe when the West, GCC, stop supporting terrorists. I made a statement. I says, after rightly rejecting the new draft constitution for Syria submitted by Russia, Syrian President Bashar al-Assad is wisely rejecting the Trump administration concept of the implementation of safe zones inside Syria. That comment has gotten me more mail than many of the other things I've said, because it referred to the rejection of the new draft constitution by the Syrian government. Here I have to say I could have chosen my words much better. Okay, it's not entirely inaccurate, but I should have chosen my words better. To be clear, the Syrian government did not reject the draft constitution. They rejected provisions in the draft constitution. So they are going back to the drawing board, and they will continue to talk. So I presented it in that article. It sounds like what I wrote is saying that they rejected the whole Constitution, and if somebody inferred that from what I said, that's certainly reasonable, because that's basically what I said, and I wanted to clear that up here on the show and say that they did not reject the new Constitution. They rejected provisions of it, and I apologize for the confusion in that statement. We'll try to be more careful with our wording next time when I put these articles out. And I'm not complaining when I said I got more emails. This just means that the people who are reading them are actually paying attention to what I'm saying and aren't afraid to call me out on it. So I appreciate everybody who emailed me and corrected my language there. And again, so thank you for that. But we do have Assad in his first interview with Western media since the election of Donald Trump, and he said that the plan was a bad idea, said it would have no real ability to protect civilians or end the Syrian crisis. He was asked by an interviewer for Yahoo News about Trump's statement that he would absolutely create safe zones in Syria for the Syrian people, and this is what Assad responded by saying. He said, "But actually it won't protect civilians. It won't. Safe zones for the Syrians could only happen when you have stability and security, where you don't have terrorists, or you don't have the flow and support of those terrorists by the neighboring countries or by Western countries. This is where you can have a natural safe zone, which is our country. They don't need safe zones at all. It's not a realistic idea at all." So then we had the interviewer pressing Assad on the fact that so many Syrians have been displaced, and then basically saying, how can you oppose safe zones with all these people have been displaced? And Assad says, quote, "The first thing you have to ask is why were they displaced? If you don't answer that question, you cannot answer the rest. They were displaced for two reasons. First of all, the terrorist acts and the support from the outside. Second, the U.S. embargo on Syria. Many people didn't only leave Syria because of the security issues. As you can see, Damascus is safe today. It's nearly normal life, not completely. But they don't find a way for life in Syria, so they have to travel abroad in order to find their living. So if you lift the embargo and if you stop supporting the terrorists," I'm talking about everyone who supported terrorists, including the United States during Obama's administration, "if you stop all these acts, most of the people will go back to their country." All right, so in this short interview clip, Assad is echoing the same sentiment and solutions that I and many other Syrian researchers and analysts have been saying since the beginning of the crisis. Basically, if America wants to stop terrorism in Syria, it simply needs to stop funding it and supporting it and directing it. It's that simple. The U.S. could also call on its allies, like Saudi Arabia and Turkey and the UK and France and Qatar and Israel to do the same. It could work with Russia to eliminate the remnants of terrorist forces. It could provide information and coordinates to Syria and Russia on the whereabouts of terrorists and terrorist forces. Those are the things that we're calling on the Trump administration to do. So let's do that formally. Let's say we're calling on the Trump administration to immediately stop funding, supporting, and directing terrorists in Syria. We call on the Trump administration to call on America's allies, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, France, England, Germany, to whatever extent they are, Canada, Israel, Qatar, the GCC, to stop supporting and directing and funding terrorists. And we encourage the Trump administration to call the Russian president and express a desire for peace in Syria, work with Russia to eliminate what's left of the terrorist forces, work with the Syrian government, call them, express a desire for peace, and provide information and coordinates to both the Syrian and Russian governments on the whereabouts of the terrorists that are still there. And of course we could give ourselves a week or two or whatever we need, a couple of weeks, to get all of our special forces out, all of our troops, all of our advisors, all of our CIA agents that we know are there. We can get them out safely and then tell Russia and Syria to commence the bombing and destroy these terrorists. We also want to call on the Trump administration immediately to end all support for armed groups in Syria, period. That includes the Kurds. begin rapprochement with Russia and Syria. Look toward the future now. We have to look at the possibility of investment in rebuilding Syria as a country, as well as immediately ending these ridiculous, horrible sanctions that are currently in place against the Syrian people. Those sanctions always have an effect on the people, not so much the governments. Now, one of the other things that I thought I would bring up is, in that interview, we have Assad sitting before a Western public now who's been politicized and propagandized for some time, so that they believe that he's a butcher. And he's being asked a number of questions that were raised as a result of the Trump election, and of course this recently released report by Amnesty International alleging the execution by hanging of 13,000 prisoners at Sednaya prison. The Amnesty report, again, it was written well. We give it credit for being written well, but it lacked any relevant evidence, and it's just one more example of politicized human rights and human rights campaigning that has its roots in the U.S. State Department and the Office of George Soros, designed to demonize the Syrian government and drum up public support for some type of military action against the Syrian military, at least continued Western support of terrorists. So in his reply to the question regarding the Amnesty report, we have Assad rightly identifying the report in mainstream corporate press reporting surrounding the Amnesty report as fake news. And this is a fact. It's becoming increasingly clear not only in the United States but in the Western world as a whole, meaning that the corporate press is just nothing more than a 24/7 barrage of fiction designed to manipulate the minds of its audience for the benefit of an agenda that's not readily apparent to its viewers. This is what he says. So Amnesty International knows more about Syria than me, according to you. No, that's not true. No, they haven't been to Syria. They only base their reports on allegations. They can bring anyone, doesn't matter what's his title. You can forge anything these days, and we're living in a fake news era, as you know. So again, he mentioned fake news twice, actually, when the interviewer addressed that Qatari-funded report, the Caesar report that came about in 2014. And he says, yeah, and the question, when your institutions were honest, or basically what he's saying, when were your institutions honest about what's happening in Syria? That's the question. Never. For us, never. So we don't have to rely on what they say. Whether if the FBI says something, it's not evidence for anyone, especially for us. The most important thing, if you take these photos to any court in your country, could they convict any criminal regarding these? Could they tell you what is this crime and who committed it? If you don't have this full picture, you cannot make judgment. It's just propaganda. It's just fake news. They want to demonize the Syrian government. In every war, you can have any individual crime. It happened here all over the world, anywhere. But it's not a policy. It's not policy. Okay, so it's ironic that the term fake news was actually developed by the White House and the State Department and the coterie of corporate media outlets and the NGO community for the purpose of shaming and maligning the alternative media. But after years of being exposed for literally faking stories and distorting narratives, now it appears that the term fake news has blown up in their own faces, is constantly being applied to corporate outlets, especially CNN. So much that it's becoming a common expression now. And this is a big battle between alternative and mainstream sites and researchers and journalists calling each other fake news. So we have this interview coming back to the question of the photographs that he showed to Assad from the Qatari Caesar propaganda report, and he attempted to make Assad either step back and admit to atrocities or appear ignorant as to what was actually happening in his country. And after asking Assad if he'd investigate the photos and allegations after he'd seen them, Assad responded by saying, "You showed me many things, but you didn't show a single bit of evidence." And throughout the interview, Assad kept hammering the credibility of the Western corporate media and the human rights organizations, and the claims being made by the U.S. State Department. At one point, the interview did his best to paint Assad as a conspiracy theorist. He tried to portray his accusation that the U.S. and all its institutions were colluding in propaganda against Syria as self-evidently delusional. You could hear it in his tone. You can't possibly say that the State Department and the media and the human rights organizations would collude to paint Syria badly. That's ridiculous. This is what Assad says. No, I'm not making any allegations. They supported the terrorists, and you go back to what they said. John Kerry a few months ago said, and by his voice, that we were watching ISIS advancing and we expected the Syrian president to make concessions. What does it mean? Obama said it in an interview in one of his speeches that the war in Iraq created ISIS. So who supported ISIS? We didn't create it. You created it. The United States created all this mess. Who supported the rebels and called them moderate rebels while they became ISIS and al-Nusra in Syria? We didn't. So it's not our responsibility. These are facts. This is reality. We didn't give money. We didn't support these terrorists. Your country supported them. UK, France, publicly. And they said they sent armaments. We didn't. So you can take that, what I said, it's not my allegations. It's your official allegation, including Joe Biden, the vice president of Obama. He said about Saudi Arabia and other countries supporting this. And they actually cut him off at this point to say, well, we're not talking about Saudi Arabia, right? I'm not interviewing Saudi Arabia. I'm interviewing the president of Syria. Well, I think he got his point across, but still, it's anything they can do to try to cover it up. In the interview, it's funny, the reporter gave Assad the opportunity to speak to the Trump administration via the interview and say, this is your opportunity to convey a message to the Trump administration. And Assad said, I wouldn't convey the message to the media. I would send it through different channels, maybe diplomatic channels. But any message for us is the public one. We don't have two messages. We have one stand, one position toward what's happening in Syria, and it's about fighting terrorism. So clearly he made the right decision. Had he taken that opportunity to convey a message, it's clear that it would have been edited and distorted so that it scarcely resembled anything that he actually said. This can be seen in the way that corporate media treats statements by anybody not considered completely in line with the shadow government's wishes, or even the President of the United States himself, when it's deemed time to gin up social discord and general ignorance. Obviously, Assad is right not to trust the Western media and to dismiss Western human rights organizations like Amnesty International or Human Rights Watch and intelligence law enforcement agencies, since they've all, from day one, actively colluded together to demonize and destabilize and destroy the Syrian government as well as the very fabric of the country. So Americans would do well to share his distrust after over 16 years of constant warfare now promoted by these outlets and organizations. None of these institutions should have any credibility in the minds of Americans or foreign observers. So if anybody wants to read the text of the Assad interview, go to my website, brandonturbeville.com, and read the article, Syrian President Assad Calls Western Atrocity Reports Fake News. And you can read the transcript there. You can also see the video, although I think that the video has already been taken down from YouTube, but you can probably easily search it. But of course, the transcript is there for you. Now, what can we say now? We have lots to discuss with the Donald Trump micro coup, I guess we should say, not by Trump. Oh, actually, wait. Let us. I want to mention something else. Since we talked about solutions in terms of what the U.S. should do in Syria, we also need to talk about what Syria should do, because we have a situation in which a draft constitution is being brought up. Now, what did the Syrian government object to in this discussion? They objected to Kurdish autonomy, and they should have objected to Kurdish autonomy. Only the Kurds, by the way, supported Kurdish autonomy. Even the terrorist monkey representatives didn't support it. The government, of course, oppose that. But what are the benefits of the new constitution that's been proposed by Russia, and what are the implications of the new constitution, and will it get the support of Syrians? To be honest, I'd be hard-pressed to present anybody with anything positive about this draft constitution. I have to say Russia did a real bad job at creating this. Kurdish autonomy is just one negative aspect of the draft. I'm not sure who thought much of this document would be a good idea. The concept of some type of confessional system for Syria, which is what the draft describes, is absolutely ludicrous. Look at Lebanon. Confessional system, for those of you who don't know, is basically that the government is made up of representative portions of religious groups. So in Lebanon you have the president always has to be Christian, the vice president has to be Shiite, maybe the speaker of the parliament has to be Sunni, different positions have to be Druze or whatever. And the members in parliament is based on the population of people who are of this religion. So there's majority Christians, there'll be majority Christians in the parliament. Majority Sunnis, there'll be majority Sunnis in the parliament. So that's a confessional system, and it's an awful idea. It's an awful idea in Lebanon. It's incredibly fragile, but the government is easily manipulated as a result of it. The place is always on the brink of another 20-some-year civil war. We don't want this for Syria, and it's a ridiculous concept. Syria's always been multi-ethnic, multi-religious. They're secular. They don't need these ridiculous style demands. A confessional system. If you want a weak government, that's a weak government. Civil war will probably ensue. There's also questions, despite statements supporting free speech and expression, there's a very disturbing element of political correctness and European-style censorship of actual free speech. One of the things is that basically speech that is uttered that can be seen as a threat to the social order, I don't know what would it be. Say maybe a Shiite comes out and says Sunnis are scum, and if these people were eliminated, then Syria would be great. Okay, that's that's free speech. But this, under the new constitution, would actually be a crime. So they say they support free speech, but certain speech is not allowed. And this is, of course, this is European-style censorship at best, right? This is when you go to Europe and you say, we support free speech, we're a free society, but if you question the Holocaust, you go to jail. We support free speech, but if you say someone is, if you say a woman is not actually a man, just because she identifies with it that day, then you're a criminal, and that's a hate crime. That we're getting, and this is what's shocking. Is not that it was put in, but what's shocking was it put in by Russia. Because this is not a place that's necessarily made up of social justice warriors. Now, there's some very troubling aspects as to how this constitution would actually allow the proposed democracy that they're talking about to work in reality. The question is, how is it going to be made up? How is the parliament going to look? How are things going to be divided? What is the checks and balances of power? What is the level of freedom of speech? Is it going to be a confessional system where people are going to have autonomy? It's just not clear at all, and hopefully these things could be worked out. The only positive aspect to the draft that I can see is that it calls for the military to essentially stay out of domestic affairs. And in terms of support, I haven't talked to any Syrian who supported the draft so far. I think the only hope it has for support by the average Syrians is the possibility that they're so tired of war that they might accept it. But I don't think that is really in the Syrian genetic code, this idea of being tired of war, so we accept a servile type of existence. At this point, the only support I see for the new constitution is in the quarters of the negotiators and the Syrian opposition. the government, but I personally believe that the government is probably, and the opposition, are probably just angling for more time. And I think the opposition probably would support the new Constitution more simply because they believe they'd be able to give themselves some power in the new makeup of the government. The government, of course, is probably saying they support it to buy themselves more time and trying to maintain as much power as they can, but not the people on the ground. I don't see any support for it there. So one of the most important parts of the draft, right, what people are talking about is the makeup of Parliament and presidential power and how that's going to interact. There's some question, though, as to what this new Parliament is actually even going to look like, as I said before, in terms of whether it's going to have higher or lower houses. It's unclear. I don't think parliamentary responsibility is necessarily a bad thing, so long as it doesn't turn into a rule by council type of situation. But you need more information to be presented just to see how powerful or weak the new Syrian parliament would be. But I would argue that a separation of powers is what is needed, with delineated authorities for the executive, the judicial, and the legislative branches, not dissimilar to what we have here. Now, the question of Kurdish autonomy, I'm sure that many Kurds are going to support this. At least Kurdish fighters and separatists and Kurds that are consumed with identity politics or ethnic fanaticism are going to support it. But of course, not all Kurdish people are going to support it. These groups don't represent all Kurdish people. They're fanatic. They're either Islamic fanatic, they're Kurdish fanatics, or they're this bizarre communist, cultural Marxist brainwashing cult. So there's a portion that doesn't support it and a portion that will, and the people who don't support it, the idea of Kurdish autonomy, are going to want to continue to stay in a secular Syria that's governed by laws instead of religion or communist ideology. Now, our suggestions for Syria, and this is brief, we'll go into this more detail in the future. It's not something that's pressing. It's something to be on the radar, and it's not an emergency yet, but we are going to do what we can to contribute to the discourse. So where do we start? There's certainly no shortage of areas to improve. I just want to give a brief outline of some areas I think need to be absolutely included in the Constitution of Syria. And then again, perhaps we'll get down into the details. We're just trying to do what we can. This is not so much analysis, although it's part of it, but this is an attempt to hopefully influence the discussion. The first thing I would do is suggest removing the name Arab from the identity of the Syrian state. The identity needs to be Syrian, not Arab. Not Syrian Arab Army anymore. It should be the Syrian Army. We also need to see that the Constitution ensures full secular government by a number of measures, like eliminating, and this is an example, eliminating any religious-based limitations. Okay. For instance, the prevention of anybody other than a Muslim to hold specific government office, for instance. Right now the president has to be a Muslim. That has got to be changed. Absolutely has to be changed. I do think also we want to suggest that there has to be a separation of powers. We need the presidential, which is the executive, the legislative, which is the parliament, and the judicial, which is the Supreme Court. And we want that with an attempt to produce a system of checks and balances. Also, we have to argue that we need a constitutional statement that equal rights are guaranteed to everybody. That's it, regardless of your religion, regardless of your ethnicity, regardless of your gender. So yes, this would be a guarantee of equal rights for women. Now, Syria is a secular society. Syrian culture is a culture in which women do have equal rights, right? There's women in the government. There's no stupidity like Saudi Arabia where women can't drive. I mean, if you go to Syria, trust me, you'll see that it's secular culture and that women have these rights, and it's egalitarian in that sense. But it's actually, in terms of the law, it needs to be codified, and that's what we're suggesting. Secularism is a must. Religion and politics don't mix. Political Islam, political Christianity, and political Judaism have to be done away with. And that needs to be codified as well. Equal rights are a must. The Constitution needs to explicitly codify equal rights between men and women, between Muslims and Christians and Jews and Kurds and Druze and all that. It also needs basic protections against unjust search and seizure and imprisonment. We argue that not only unjust search and seizure and imprisonment, but the rights of the individual need to be addressed in a very clear form, and the Syrians should be given the right to self-defense and the possession of means by which to defend themselves. I would argue that many people would not have been killed in Syria had the Syrians had a Second Amendment. Now, where do we want to talk about here? The autonomy. All ideas regarding autonomy need to be abandoned. Syria is multi-ethnic. It's multi-religious. Forget autonomy. I would also suggest that the new constitution specify that the Syrian National Bank, or the Bank of Syria, it has to remain a national bank. This is something I would like to see codified in the Constitution, that from here on out, the Syrian National Bank has to remain a national bank, has to be completely controlled by the Syrian government, completely dependent on the Syrian government. It should never be independent. It should never be allowed independence. It should never become privatized. It should never become a central bank. This should be made law in the Constitution. It's imperative. As soon as private bankers get control over that bank, you guys are going to lose whatever rights you have, and it's going to start eroding. Now, there's a lot of Syrian analysts who are arguing that the Syrian Constitution of 1950 could serve as a basis for a new constitution. Some are saying that the Tunisian Constitution in 2014. Some are saying that there's other constitutions. I don't think Syria necessarily needs to look at copying anybody else's constitution or even the documents of its past. I think it simply needs to look what is best for the Syrian people from a standpoint of human rights and the ability of Syria to survive and thrive in the world in the 21st century, and just go from there. Other countries may have some good advice, and they should be heard when their ideas do have merit, but the decision is a Syrian decision, not an American one, not a Turkish one, or a Russian one. I would also say I would warn against working with the United Nations here. It is not an impartial actor, should not be trusted with input. The UN has actually done more to hamper human rights than it's done to promote them. It is working for the world banking system, essentially, so stay away from that. To adapt an adage that we use in the United States, Syria needs to adopt an agenda that's Syria first, and I mean the rights of the Syrian people. So that's my input there. Now, one more thing before we go to discuss the micro coup. I didn't mention this at the beginning of the show, but I should mention it now. This broadcast is the 200th broadcast of Truth on the Tracks. We have been on the air. We've done 200 shows. I actually don't know the year when we started because it just occurred to me that this is show number 200. Maybe, I'm sure Jules will know. We'll have to, if she's in the chat tonight, maybe she can post up how many years the show's been on UCY. And ever since we started the show, I've seen UCY grow from a small station that only had just a couple radio programs on it, and they're being rebroadcast throughout the night to a station now, a network that is got some of the best hosts in alternative media radio, and in fact, it would rival anywhere else. Go look at the show list, and I think you'll see some of the best hosts, some of the best programs that you could possibly find. And if I'm the only show you listen to on UCY, I'd encourage you to go down the list and just check some of the other shows out. But regardless, I want to thank all of you for listening to the show as long as you have. I mean, again, when I first started, I don't know how many listeners I had. It couldn't have been much, but now we're at show number 200, and Truth on the Tracks has gotten much bigger. It's more than quadrupled in terms of its listenership, 2 or 3 times over, and now we're reaching international audiences, obviously because we're on the internet, but more and more people are coming in from Europe, and of course even the Middle East. We're getting people in the Middle East listening in, and Canada, I believe. We've got a lot of listeners in England, some in Germany, and France, and the Middle East. Again, we've got listeners in Lebanon and Syria. So, of course, the United States is our biggest market. And again, I thank everybody for tuning in. And I know I've been on this network for a couple of years, but yeah, I don't know what else to add to that. And just thank everybody for continuing to listen to the show. We plan to be here a while, and keep listening. And again, go to BrandonTurbeville.com. You can catch the archives. I always post up the archives of the show, and and you can catch the old broadcast. So now back down to business. Let's look at the micro coup. We had a surprising turn. It was announced that the National Security Advisor Michael Flynn resigned from his post after allegations surrounding inappropriate contact with Russian officials, and then he admitted that he had provided incomplete information to the President and Vice President regarding that contact. The resignation takes place amid FBI investigations into Flynn's phone calls with the Russian ambassador, and weeks after the Justice Department sent a letter to the Trump administration regarding the potential for Flynn to be subject to blackmail if the allegations were true. We even have the U.S. Army reportedly investigating Flynn for his possible acceptance of Russian money during trips made to Russia in the past. Now, on that, I have to confess a bit of ignorance. We need to go back and check this out and see was Flynn in the military at the time, or was he retired? Was he in the military? Was he out the military? That's gonna answer questions about whether or not he accepted Russian money illegally or inappropriately. We have, of course, the mainstream media went absolutely ballistic at this report. And I tried to find one of the less hysterical reports, and I found that on Yahoo News. It's at least attempted to refrain from channeling the ghost of Joe McCarthy, as all the others were doing. I mean, you could scarcely listen to CNN and that shit. But we have this article. I'll give you the article. It's Conway Flynn resigned because he'd become a lightning rod, and this is Yahoo News. And I want to read through part of this because it's a sample of how corporate media outlets are trying or tried to portray the resignation, but minus the hyperbole, so you don't have to hear too much of that. So I'll read a couple paragraphs, and then we'll get to the analysis of what happened. National Security Advisor Michael Flynn has resigned following reports he misled Vice President Mike Pence about contacts with a Russian diplomat, upending President Donald Trump's White House team less than a month after his inauguration. In a resignation letter, Flynn said he gave Pence and others incomplete information about his calls with Russia's ambassador to the U.S. The vice president, apparently relying on information from Flynn, initially said the national security advisor had not discussed sanctions with the Russian envoy, though Flynn later conceded the issue may have come up. Such conversations would breach diplomatic protocol and possibly violate the Logan Act, a law aimed at keeping private citizens from conducting U.S. diplomacy. The Justice Department also had warned the White House late last month that Flynn could be in a compromised position because of contradictions between his public depictions of the calls and what intelligence officials knew to be true, based on routine recordings of communications with foreign officials who were in the U.S. A U.S. official told the Associated Press that Flynn was in frequent contact with Ambassador Sergei Kislyak on the day that the Obama administration slapped sanctions on Russia for an election-related hacking, as well as other times during the transition. An administration official and two people with knowledge of the situation confirmed the Justice Department warnings on condition of anonymity because they were not authorized to discuss the matter publicly. It was unclear when Trump and Pence learned about the Justice Department outreach. Okay, end quote. No, this is another part of the article I wanted to get. The Washington Post was the first to report on the communication between former acting Attorney General Sally Yates, holdover from the Obama administration, and the Trump White House. The Post also first reported last week that Flynn had indeed spoken about sanctions with the Russian ambassador. Okay, so let's talk about number one, Flynn's alleged crime. His resignation and the allegations that were made against him fit right in with the narrative that's been promoted by the Western media and the Democratic Party and the Soros Republicans and Soros and the NGO community. Basically, the idea that the Russians are influencing American elections and now influencing American policy via secret connections with the Trump administration and Trump supporters due to the preponderance of Russian propaganda on American television. Now, that is an exercise in abject delusional hysteria. It would make Joe McCarthy scratch his head in disbelief. At least in McCarthy's day, there were actually some communists that were lurking about that he could rout out. In the State Department, no less. In 2017, though, there's yet to be a single shred of evidence that the Russians hacked or influenced anything to do with the American elections or American policy, foreign or domestic. And that is not stopping the corporate media, which the corporate media piranhas now have a new carcass to chew on. And this race to propagandize and frighten Americans of the big Russian boogeyman, drum up support for war in the Middle East and Ukraine, as well as Russia, and to curtail virtually all rights and free speech under the guise of national security and Russophobia. But what did Flynn actually do that was so wrong? His discussion with the Russian ambassador was nothing close to a scandal. He did nothing that would be interpreted as undercutting the Obama administration's aggression. He didn't say that Obama's sanctions would be removed once Trump was in office. In fact, all he did was state that the Russians should not overreact to America's current state of aggression because a new administration was soon to take over. So is that a hint? Yeah, but a violation of the law or some type of scandalous act? Hardly. So even the hawkish and McCarthyistic New York Times had to admit that at worst, Flynn's statements could be interpreted either way. They say, still, current and former administration officials familiar with the calls said the transcript was ambiguous enough that Mr. Trump could have justified either firing or retaining Mr. Flynn. All right, so the New York Times then goes on to argue that Trump himself was more concerned with Flynn's actions becoming a focal point of controversy than actual risk to national security or any breaking of the law, or perhaps he was more angry that Flynn lied to Pence regarding the nature of the call and the statements that were made there. But it doesn't really seem like Donald Trump to be overly concerned with controversy. It's simply not in his character. He seems to thrive on it. After all, his whole campaign was built on controversy. So why is Flynn really out? To be clear, Michael Flynn should have been out. He should have been fired long ago from his position as National Security Advisor. This is radical obsession with Iran. He's obviously crazed his determination to go to war with Iran. It's reason enough to ensure that he never gets anywhere near a position that would allow him to influence the U.S. government towards yet another imperialistic war of aggression in the Middle East. But merely suggesting to Russia that perhaps when the new administration takes over, the U.S. might not continue to pursue a policy of World War III and nuclear holocaust is not necessarily Watergate or even grounds for firing. So given the fact that Trump had won the election and was merely waiting in the wings to take power, Flynn's statements need to be taken in the proper context. So even taking all the other accusations into consideration, like the dinner with Putin, Flynn's alleged crimes, they pale in comparison when they're compared to what is considered business as usual in Washington. After all, where was the outcry regarding Hillary Clinton's obvious and only thinly veiled financial relationship with China and Saudi Arabia when she was acting Secretary of State? If she could maintain her position within the State Department amid all the clear evidence of her own scandals, the pay-to-play scandals, then why is Flynn being held to a much, much, much higher standard? American politicians for years have violated the Logan Act. They've been meeting with foreign politicians, officials, actively planning policy at global confabs like the Bilderberg meeting, without one word from the U.S. government, without one word from the mainstream media. So again, the question has to be asked: what is behind Michael Flynn's resignation? Now, Chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee at the Federation Council, Konstantin Kosachev, his reaction to Flynn's resignation is perhaps the most accurate and simplified version of what is taking place in the U.S. government command structure. Shortly after Flynn's resignation was announced, Kosachev posted a status on Facebook saying that the decision for Flynn to resign upon request was, quote, not just paranoia, but something even worse. He also said, quote, either Trump hasn't found the necessary independence and he's been driven into a corner, or Russophobia has permeated the new administration from top to bottom, end quote. Now, it's got to be noted that Kosachev's statement is the statement of a Russian lawmaker and not the official statement of the Russian government, meaning the Kremlin. But Kosachev's statement is illuminating, to say the least. There are four possibilities here. He mentions two of them, but I'm going to mention all four. The first possibility is, simply put, we are witnessing yet another seamless transition of power, and that the same anti-Russian, pro-imperialist policies are going to continue to be implemented in the Trump administration just as they were in the Obama administration, albeit in a more conservative Republican version. The other possibility is that Kosachev, as he pointed out, perhaps Donald Trump is finding out that he is nothing more than a figurehead for this well-entrenched and well-established deep state, that he has no real control over events. It's also quite possible now that elements within the deep state who are amply represented in Trump's cabinet are taking the reins and steering the wagon in another direction, independent of anything Trump has to say. This is, of course, assuming that Trump is actually working for the benefit of the American people, which I'm not working under that assumption. It's a highly implausible assumption, to say the least, but it's still worth considering since it's happened several times in the past. And, we are subject to variables in the universe. So, a third possibility. Perhaps we are simply witnessing a new act in a very carefully scripted theater that's partly designed to further the agenda of anti-Russian pro-war sentiment under the neocon Republican cover, and partly designed to reinforce the anti-Russian narrative being peddled mostly by the left until there's a clear synthesis of delusion that Russia is the natural enemy of the United States and a threat to our way of life. And lastly, there is the possibility that we're witnessing an intelligence community micro-coup against the Trump administration. Eliminating Michael Flynn is the first shot over the bow. So whatever the nature of Trump in this scenario, there is the very real possibility that there are two factions in the American government and that an internal civil war is actually taking place. And, of course, out of those four possibilities that I just went through, I think there's also the possibility, a fifth possibility, is that we're seeing a mixture of any number of the previous possibilities that I just talked about, that are taking shape. So, who replaces Flynn, and who replaces the replacement? These are important questions. It appears Flynn's going to be replaced with retired General Keith Kellogg. Kellogg, I encourage you to read an article by Kurt Nemo, by the way. Trump replaces Flynn with boss of super secret surveillance contractor. He has an interesting history. He's, in addition to his disastrous mismanagement of the Coalition Provisional Authority in Iraq, he is president of Abraxas, which is a subsidiary of Cubic Corporation. Cubic provides diversified systems and services to the transportation and defense market worldwide, so it's a defense contractor, essentially defense corporation, military-industrial complex. LA Times in 2006 says about Abraxas, in the burgeoning field of intelligence contractors, an especially aggressive upstart is Abraxas Corporation, a privately held company that has assembled a deep roster of CIA veterans to handle a wide range of clandestine assignments, including secret work for an elite team of overseas case officers. The company was founded by a group of former high-ranking agency employees led by Richard Hollis Helms, a longtime overseas officer in the Middle East and one-time head of the CIA's European Division, and Richard Calder, who was the agency's Deputy Director for Administration. Abraxas is right down the street from the CIA, okay? So they have, apparently, not only being right down the street from the CIA, they have this unmarked third-floor office suite in McLean, Virginia. It's 2 miles from the CIA headquarters. It's mainly specialized in providing veteran operatives and report officers for positions in overseas stations, CIA headquarters, that sort of stuff. Abraxas is responsible for Trapwire, which is a tech company that develops a homonymous predictive software system designed to find patterns indicative of terrorist attacks. It's a secret project, and it was discovered by WikiLeaks in 2012 after emails were hacked from Stratfor. That it's often described as a shadow version of the CIA itself. Trapwire uses a series of surveillance cameras around the country and also outside of the country to detect suspicious behavior, and the system is reportedly located in every high-value target in New York City. It is sold to local law enforcement. We have Privacy Sauce reporting that there's a website maintained by the U.S. Homeland Security Department's Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA, which includes Trapwire as a product for sale to law enforcement agencies and first responders. There you find the background and operational concept of the system that's described in detail, and it directs curious customers to abraxascore.com for more information. When you click the URL link, the banner at the top of the homepage described Abraxas as a cubic company. And then on the FEMA page, the product information is detailed, is provided directly by Abraxas Applications. Sounds pretty much like a CIA front organization to me. If he replaces Flynn, we can expect an expansion of the surveillance state and its industries without a doubt. Remember, Trump did say in 2015 that he tends to err on the side of security, and restoring parts of the Patriot Act that's been amended would be fine. And then the CIA director, Mike Pompeo, which we need to say more about him because he's definitely highly questionable. He introduced legislation to block the USA Freedom Act in 2015, which would have essentially allowed the certain parts of the Patriot Act to expire. So Pompeo was instrumental in making sure that they did not expire. We also have the possibility that Trump is considering 2 other people, one of them being David Petraeus. This is frightening. This guy is deep state. He's CIA. He is the victim of a Mata Hari operation in years past, but we can't spend too much time on that. We're running out of time, and I need to get to this. Every mainstream outlet joined the hysteria regarding Flynn's resignation. The fact is, in and of itself, reason enough to suggest a coordinated campaign. It's also important to note that the leaks of the conversation were originally printed in the Washington Post, and it's an outlet that's long been known as a leak outlet for the CIA. In fact, it was the acting Attorney General left over from the Obama administration, Sally Q. Yates. She was the one who issued the warning to the Trump administration regarding Flynn's statements and conversation with the Russian ambassador. And I don't even think it's so much Yates. The attack on Flynn was initiated before Trump ever took office. During the last days of the Obama administration, we had CIA Director John Brennan and James Clapper, who was the director of the Office of National Intelligence. These guys were instrumental in cocking up the ridiculous Russian election hacking scandal and the evidence-bearer reports that came as a result of that. But it was the CIA, apparently, monitoring Flynn's conversation and arguing that his appointment would be a potential risk to national security in the Trump administration. This is what the Washington Post says. In the waning days of the Obama administration, James R. Clapper Jr., who was the Director of National Intelligence, and John Brennan, the CIA Director at the time, shared Yates's concerns and concurred with her recommendation to inform the Trump White House. They feared that Flynn had put himself in a compromising position and thought that Pence had a right to know that he had been misled, according to one of the officials who, like others, spoke on the condition of anonymity to discuss intelligence matters. We also we have former Ohio Congressman Dennis Kucinich saying what he did on TV. The danger here is that a phone call was intercepted from the incoming National Security Advisor to the President-elect and then given to the media for dissemination. This is an incredibly important piece of the puzzle. This is what he says. Kucinich says this: what's at the core of this is an effort by some in the intelligence community to upend any positive relationship between the U.S. and Russia. And I tell you, there's a marching band and chowder society out there. There's gold in them their hills. There are people trying to separate the U.S. and Russia so that this military-industrial intel axis can cash in. There's a game going on inside the intelligence community where there are those who want to separate the U.S. from Russia in a way that would reignite the Cold War. What's going on in the intelligence community with this new president is unprecedented. They're making every effort to upend him. Who knows what the truth is anymore? There's something very wrong here in the intelligence community. He also says, first of all, he's got to get a hold of his own intelligence apparatus. You know, this isn't a joke. This is a serious matter. If he doesn't get control of where the information's coming from, he'll never know the truth. The American people won't know the truth, and we can be set at war with almost any country. Be very careful is my warning this morning. That's Dennis Kucinich. And I agree, and we only have a few seconds left. This is clear. Whatever reason is actually behind this, we see that the CIA essentially ousted the National Security Advisor for whatever reason. And I would encourage the Trump administration to do two things. That is, immediately indict the individuals you believe are responsible for this leak. Free Chelsea Manning and open up a jail cell for John Brennan and James Clapper. They need to be immediately indicted and questioned regarding what they know and how they knew it, because I agree with Dennis Kucinich. This is not a joke. It's not a laughing matter. And we're also being prepped for civil war in the United States. We're being prepped possibly for a presidential coup. We're being prepped for serious social unrest. And when I say civil war, I mean actual breakdown of society, civil war, violence, bloodshed, economic crisis, martial law, and a presidential coup. I'm not saying that to fearmonger. I'm not saying that to pimp products. I don't have any products other than the books. I'm saying that because I'm honestly seeing that this is a possibility. Please don't panic. I'm not calling for panic. I'm not calling for everybody to go out and buy gold and storable food. I am calling, however, for people to start paying attention to these events, start getting involved, start speaking out, but also start preparing for the possible necessity of having to hunker down and ride this thing out. And it's very important that people hear that message. Ladies and gentlemen, this has been Truth on the Tracks, the 200th broadcast of Truth on the Tracks. I'm Brandon Turbeville. We'll see you next week. They told us that
This is Ozzy Skateboard, and you're listening to UCY.TV.